Now let's look at the relationship between inflation and interest rates. We'll be looking at nominal interest rates and interest rates corrected for inflation, real interest rates. And next, we'll also look at the economic costs of inflation, why economists think inflation is bad. It's not for the reason you think, actually, it's for something else. We'll look at that. So, what's the relationship between inflation and interest rate? Now, the nominal interest rate is the interest rate that you get paid if you put money in the bank. Let's say I go to a bank and I say, here's $10,000 at the end of the year. They'll give me my money back plus interest. That's the nominal interest rate. Or I borrow money to buy an apartment. I get a mortgage. I borrow $1 million from the bank, and the bank will say, oh, your million, you have to pay us interest 8%. It's in the contract. That's the nominal rate. Now, that interest rate, the one in the contract, is not adjusted for inflation. It doesn't reflect the true cost of borrowing. Inflation is prices are going up. Now, suppose the inflation is 10% per year, but the nominal interest rate, the amount that I pay them, is only 8% per year. Well, then, in a sense, I gain, right? Because whatever I buy with the money I borrow, it's gone up 10% in price, but I only need to pay them 8%. So let's say I borrow $1 million and what I bought has gone up by 10%. Now it's worth 1,100,000. I only have to pay them back 1 million plus 80,000. So I gain if the inflation is higher than nominal interest rate. So we need to adjust the nominal rate by inflation to reflect the true cost of borrowing money. This adjustment, after we adjust this, the interest rate is called the real interest rate. The real interest rate is the nominal rate adjusted by inflation, and it reflects the true cost of borrowing money, the true cost of the true return on capital. That is, in the capital markets where people are borrowing, lending, how much are borrowers paying, how much are lenders being paid in real terms. That's the real interest rate. And to calculate the real interest rate, we just take the nominal rate, we subtract out the inflation rate. That gives us the real interest rate. Now, this is not exactly correct. This is a shortcut, actually. It is an estimate. The accurate calculation would actually be 1 plus r is equal to 1 plus I divided by 1 plus pi. That is, 1 plus the real interest rate is equal to 1 plus the nominal rate divided by 1 plus inflation. Because when we adjust for inflation, usually you need to divide. But if the numbers are small, that is, let's say the interest rate is less than 10%, inflation is less than 10%, then this estimate r is equal to I minus pi is more or less accurate. It's just maybe a little bit off, but it's good enough. So we're going to use this for the class. So let's have a look at an example of calculating real interest rates. So we suppose we have $1,000. We put the money in the bank, and the bank pays us 9%. So at the end of the year, I get $1,090 back. Do I gain this full 9%? Not really, not if there's inflation. Suppose the inflation rate is 3.5%. If the inflation rate is 3.5%, then the value that I can buy with $1,090 is not the full amount of 1,090. We have to calculate, we have to adjust for inflation, we have to deflate by 3.5%. It's rather about 1,055. So 1,090 at the end of the year can buy about 1,055 at the beginning of the year. So my 1,090 at the end of the year, I've only gained 5.5%. So that is the real return on savings. That's the real return on capital. Now, if the inflation rate was 9% and I get back 1,090 at the end of the year, actually I gain nothing. Because if inflation is 9%, at the end of the year, 1,090 will buy exactly as much as 1,000 would have bought at the beginning of the year. So if we look at nominal interest rates and inflation over the last 50 years, we find that it's quite variable. It goes up, it goes down. Look at beginning of 1970s, about 5, 6%. And then in the 1980s, it went up very high, more than 10%. And then this is the US. And then in 2000s, it went down to almost 2%. So highly variable movements in inflation and interest rates. But the real interest rate, that is the difference between the nominal interest rate and inflation, tends to be more stable. It was about 1% over this time. It went from negative 3% to about positive 3%. Now, why did it go negative? I'll talk about that in a while. But the point I'm making is that real interest rates tend to be more stable than nominal interest rates and inflation. Real interest rates being the true cost of capital. So you can see that nominal interest rates and inflation rate actually tend to track each other, so that the difference between the two, the real interest rate, that gap tends to be smaller than nominal interest rates and inflation. That gap tends to be fairly stable over time. Here again, we have nominal interest rates, and this is real interest rates. Now, interestingly, in the late 1970s, the real interest rate went negative. This is very unexpected, because if the real interest rate is negative, it means essentially the bank is paying you to borrow from them. Imagine that you've borrowed $1 million from the bank, and you pay the bank 5%, and then the inflation rate is 10%. You borrow money from the bank, you go and buy a factory, at the end of the year it's worth $1,100,000. But you only owe the factory $1,050,000. So instead of instead of you paying the bank essentially has paid you to borrow from them, because your factory is now worth $1,100,000. You pay back the bank $1,050,000, you have $50,000 free. So you've borrowed money, you've got a factory to use for 1 year, and you've got extra money as well. That's what happens when the real interest rate is negative. Now, why did it go negative? It went negative because there was unexpectedly high inflation. Inflation went up higher than people expected. And so the real interest rate went negative there. Now, what does unexpected inflation do? Unexpected inflation means that on your contract where you have agreed on the interest rate, when you agree on the interest rate, you agree given expected inflation. Unexpectedly high inflation means that that interest rate you agreed on was too low. It doesn't compensate for inflation. But often when we write the loan contract, that nominal interest rate we write down, we're trying to adjust for inflation, because we want to keep the real interest rate constant. So suppose we want the real interest rate to be 2%, and we expect inflation to be 5%. Then we write down a contract nominal rate should be 7%. But inflation ends up being 9%, then we have negative 2%. And who gets hurt by this? It is the people who are lending the money out. They lend the money out, they get less in value back. So lenders are hurt by unexpected inflation. Borrowers, on the other hand, benefit, because essentially they've been paid to borrow money. So the unexpectedly high inflation means the nominal interest rate was too low. It's actually lower than the inflation rate. And so the real rate becomes negative. Or it becomes lower than we want. We might even go negative. Now, if the inflation is expected, then the borrowers and lenders will take this into account. They will adjust the interest rate charge to account for the expected inflation. So if everyone knew the inflation was going to be 9%, I'm not going to lend you money at 7%. I want at least 11% if I lend you money. And the borrower understands this, and they are willing to pay 11%. So the interest rate will adjust for any expected inflation. So when inflation is high, nominal rates are high. When inflation is low, nominal interest rates are low because people are adjusting nominal rates to adjust for inflation. Now, it's sometimes possible to avoid these unexpected transfers between borrowers and lenders by certain institutional arrangements, certain types of contracts where they adjust the inflation rate for, where they adjust the interest rate for inflation. An example of this is what we call inflation protected bonds. That's are bonds that will pay an interest that is adjusted according to what the inflation rate was. So if the inflation rate was high, the bond will pay more. If the inflation rate was low, the bond will pay less. It's inflation adjusted bonds. They are not affected by changes in inflation. But this is not common. Most bonds, most loan contracts, they have fixed nominal amounts. Anyway, the tendency for nominal interest rates to adjust for expected inflation, the tendency for nominal interest rates to go up when inflation is high and to come down when inflation is low, we call this the Fisher effect. The Fisher effect is, that nominal interest rates tend to follow inflation to keep real interest rates fairly constant. Now let's discuss the economic costs of inflation, why economists think inflation should be avoided. Now, when you ask people what's the problem with inflation, they'll probably tell you that, prices are going up, everything becomes more expensive. But that's not actually a really good objection. I mean, think about this. Suppose you wake up tomorrow and everything has one extra zero on it. All the prices have one extra zero on it, and all of the cash in your wallet also has one extra zero on it. The money in your bank account has one extra zero on it, and your wages also have one extra zero on it. Does it really matter? So when you go to the noodle shop now, instead of 30 RMB, it costs 300 RMB. But instead of earning 10,000 a month, you earn 100,000 a month. Does it really matter? Not really. Right? Everything's gone up. So with inflation, that's the way economists think about inflation in some way. If everything is going up, including your wages, and all the numbers are just changing along at the same rate, what does it matter? It doesn't really matter. So that's not, to an economist, that's not a cost of inflation. Things becoming more expensive is fine as long as your wages are also going up. And if inflation is about money losing value, then yeah, your wages go up also. Prices of everything go up, including the price of labor. So that's not a cost of inflation. So why do economists think inflation is bad? See, economists think inflation is bad because it makes the economy work less well. It has economic costs. So there's many of these economic costs. Let's go through them. Firstly, because inflation is not even throughout the whole economy. Some prices rise faster, some slower, some prices rise first, and then other prices rise. The price of this good might rise in January, and then the prices of these goods rise in March. And you have uneven prices. Then the relative prices are all going to be going up and down versus each other. This causes noise in the system. This means that the price system is working less well as a way of telling people what's expensive, what's cheap, what should they buy, how should they produce. The way a market economy works is that the price system transmits to everyone what they should be producing, because that's what people want. What they should be buying is the lowest cost good to satisfy their wants, and how they should be producing. They should produce the lowest cost. But with a noisy price system, you're not producing efficiently. You're not buying the right things. So that's this static. It's noise in the economy. It makes the economy less productive. That's the first problem with inflation. Just makes planning and doing business just more difficult. Another problem with inflation is that essentially cash holdings, money in the bank, is very useful. It's useful in that you want to use it to smooth out your consumption. You want something there. Imagine this before people use WeChat and Alipay, but imagine a cash economy. You go to a shop and you want to buy something, but you don't have cash, so you have to run to the bank to get it. You run to the bank, get it, you come out with 100 RMB bill, and then you want to buy it. And then the shop doesn't have cash, and they say, "Oh, we can't make change for you. Sorry, we can't sell you because we can't make change." So if you want to keep some cash around because it's just really useful. And cash is essentially free for the government to provide because it just prints out this currency and it's quite cheap to print. So it should provide this service to the people cheaply because it's cheap to provide. But inflation makes cash more expensive to hold. Essentially, inflation is a tax on cash holdings because inflation makes cash lose value. The same is true for money in your savings account in the bank. The money in the savings account in the bank does pay interest, and that interest does, reflect inflation to some extent, but usually it's less than inflation. So there's still some cost to holding money in the bank. And the higher the inflation is, the higher is the cost. So the higher is the cost of holding cash, the higher is the cost of holding money in the bank. Holding money, if you're using WeChat, Alipay, holding it in balance on Alipay, the inflation rate is 20% a year. That balance loses 20%. So this means people are going to try and avoid holding cash, holding money in the savings account, in the checking in the bank account. They want to conserve on cash holdings because it's being taxed essentially by the government. The inflation makes it lose value. And this makes things more inconvenient. We call this shoe leather cost. Imagine that if I want to go and buy something, I don't have the cash to buy it. I have to run to the bank, withdraw the cash, come and buy it. I have to run back and forth. My shoes wear down. That's why we call it shoe leather cost. It's the cost of replacing your shoes because you have to run around more. Now, here's a simple example to illustrate this. So don't worry too much if you don't follow the arithmetic. It's just very simple arithmetic. So we're assuming 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, just to keep things simple. Now, suppose that Woodrow, who owns a hardware shop, needs to keep $5,000 a day, which he will use up by the end of the day. Now, if there's no inflation in normal times, well, what he does is he tries to, reduce the number of trips to the bank because it's inconvenient. A trip to the bank costs him $4. So with no inflation, he goes once a week to the bank, he withdraws 25,000, and then he uses that up over the week, 5,000, 5,000, 5,000, at the end of the week, it's all gone. Now, the average amount of cash he's holding is 15,000 a day, averaged over the whole week. Now, this is essentially free to hold if there's no inflation. So this is his cost. He has to go to a bank 50 times a year. It's 4 times 50 is 200. That's his cost for going to the bank. But suppose instead inflation is 10% and his cash holdings lose value. If he holds on average 15,000 a day, then this is going to lose value at 10% a year. He's going to lose 1,500 a year to inflation. We call this the inflation tax. So he says, wow, 1,500 a year because I'm holding money. That's quite a lot of money. Let me try and reduce my cash holdings. So instead of going to the bank once a week, he goes to the bank every day. If he goes to the bank every day, he has to pay $4 a day. So instead of paying $4 a week, he has to pay 4 times 5. He has to pay $20 a week, which is $16 a week more than he would otherwise pay. It's inconvenience, but on the other hand, once you calculate that in the cost of running the bank every day, plus his lower inflation cost, because now he's only holding 5,000 a day instead of 15,000 a day, he finds that it's cheaper for him to go to the bank every day and avoid the inflation tax, avoid the cost of holding money. So this is a distortion to the system. Inflation is causing him to do something expensive, which is essentially worthless, because the government can have inflation at zero, but instead they choose not to. They choose to have a higher inflation, and this is causing Woodrow to run to the bank every day. It introduces cost to the economy. So in a similar way, the whole economy, the businesses, the people, they're all trying to reduce cash holdings. It's causing inconvenience. It's causing people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. And this introduces a cost to the economy. Another problem with inflation is it's problematic for the accounting system and hence for the taxation system. See, the accounting system assumes that money today and money last month and money 1 year ago is the same. $10 is $10 is $10. Doesn't matter when it comes in, when it goes out, it's the same value. But inflation makes it so that it actually has different values. It's the tax laws as well, which is based on inflation, assumes that money, no matter when it comes in, has the same value, and inflation is going to distort the way the tax system works. An example of this is capital depreciation. So if you buy capital, you're allowed to count it as a cost. And so it reduces the profits that you have to pay tax on. So a company pays profit tax, but you can subtract out the cost of your buying capital, but you're not allowed to subtract out the full cost all at once because capital lasts. So suppose that you buy a new machine and it costs 100,000, but the machine lasts for 10 years. You're not allowed to subtract 100,000 all at once to then pay zero profits this year. Instead, you're allowed to subtract it maybe over the course of 10 years. So every year you have to subtract 10,000, 10,000, 10,000, 10,000. Now, this depreciation allowance would be worth the same amount, 10,000, 10,000 every year, if there's zero inflation. And the tax system assumes there's zero inflation. But with inflation, every year your depreciation allowance, that is the amount you get to deduct from your income to reduce your profits, becomes worth less and less and less. So you are essentially paying a higher tax than you're supposed to. It just distorts the system. So there are other examples of this as well in distorting the system. Essentially what happens is that you're going to pay more tax if the inflation is higher. Because your profits are recorded as higher. Suppose you bought something at the beginning of the year and then you sell it at the end of the year, and you actually haven't made a real profit, but the inflation makes it look like you've made a profit. So you have to pay tax on it. So in times of inflation, you just end up having to pay more tax. You have to pay more tax for capital as well. So investment goes down, economic activity goes down. It distorts the system. Here's another example of distortion of taxes. So let's go through a transaction with a carpenter. He buys some wood and he makes furniture from it. He's got a value added of $40. $40 profit. So at a 30% tax rate, he owes $12. This is assuming no inflation. But suppose that he buys the wood at the beginning of the year and then sells the furniture at the end of the year when inflation has put the price up. Inflation has pushed the price up. His nominal profits are higher, not his real profits though, because now money is worth less. But his nominal profits are higher, and then the tax system is going to go and charge him more. So he's got to pay more than he needed to pay before. In fact, if the inflation rate is high enough, he has to pay so much in tax that it actually wipes out his profit. When that happens, you can't do business anymore. So that is a problem with high inflation countries. When the inflation rate is, let's say, 100% or more a year, the whole accounting system, tax system just breaks down, and then people stop paying taxes because it's impossible to do business. So that's a real problem. So that's a problem with having inflation. Another problem with inflation is if we have unexpected inflation. If we have unexpected inflation, as I mentioned earlier with interest and real interest rates, we have a redistribution of wealth, unexpected redistribution of wealth. If inflation is unexpectedly high, all of the people who borrowed money gain, all the people who lent money lose. If inflation is unexpectedly high, all the workers lose because they get paid less in real wages. If on the other hand, inflation is unexpectedly low, then workers are happy because they get their wages going up, but cost of living doesn't going up. And also, if inflation is unexpectedly low, all the people who borrow to invest, they're going to go bankrupt because they can't pay back. The real interest rate ends up being higher than expected. So this unexpected changes in inflation just adds noise to the economy. It makes forward planning more difficult. It makes investment more difficult. So this is another cause of inflation. When inflation is high, it becomes more variable. More variable inflation means that there's more noise, more uncertainty in investments and the future. And so that's just going to reduce economic activity. So yeah, this coming into the same thing is it makes long-term planning difficult. It makes it difficult for people to make investments, to do business. So it's just going to slow down economic activity, slow down investments, make economic growth lower. Now, all of these costs usually kick in when inflation is quite high. When inflation is low, let's say 5-10% inflation, most of these costs are quite small. But when inflation is higher, let's say 50% a year, 100% a year, 200% a year, then these costs become very large. If inflation is more than 1,000% a year, then quite often the whole economy will start to shrink instead of growing. Given that the cost of high inflation, most economists agree that you should try and keep inflation low and stable, because unexpected inflation adds uncertainty. So it's best if you keep inflation, let's say, below 10%, and you keep it at a stable number. Let's say 5% per year forever. That's good. That's fine. Today, most countries have agreed on like 2 to 3% inflation. So that's what they're going with: 2 to 3% low and stable inflation. Now, when inflation rate is high, like I said, a lot of costs associated with countries that experience high inflation. Very high inflation is called hyperinflation. Their economies actually shrink. So hyperinflation is defined as inflation rate that's more than 50% per month. And then you start having to carry more and more bills because they can't print it fast enough for you. to use. And because inflation is so high, people start demanding that they get paid every day, then twice a day. So during the hyperinflation in Germany, employers were paying their workers twice a day. Why? Because they wanted to shop in the morning before the afternoon inflation hit. And then you want to go shopping in the afternoon before the overnight inflation. So that's why you get paid twice a day, get paid, employers are paying their workers more often. And like I said, when inflation is high, more than 100% per year, the economy starts to shrink instead of growing. And the amount people have to consume, the amount they eat, their living standards are falling, and investment especially falls. So the capital of the country starts breaking down, and economic growth rates negative. The whole economy just starts to deteriorate. That's high inflation, more than 100%. Now, we've talked about inflation. I want to say a bit about what's not inflation. So inflation is when the price level rises. You can think of it as when money loses value, right? Money is worth less, so you got to use more money to buy things. So the prices of everything goes up. So the average price level is rising. People are paid more as well. That's inflation. When the prices of some goods go up, that's not inflation. That's a relative price changes. So if there's suddenly more demand for something, the price of that good will go up. That's not inflation. Inflation is about money losing value. Or if the production of some goods are restricted. During COVID, we have these supply chain problems, and then the production of goods are restricted, and prices of some goods go up because of that. Again, not inflation. Is relative price changes. It's caused by supply and demand. It's caused by market conditions. Now, sometimes these market conditions for important enough good might affect the measured inflation rate. But it's usually just a one-time thing. It's not really what we think of as core inflation, which is about money losing value. So we had petroleum prices going up over the last year. So suppose petroleum prices double or gas prices double. Yeah, it's going to hit the inflation number. It's going to hit the CPI in the month in which the petroleum prices went up. But it's not going to, the CPI is not going to go up double just because the petroleum price doubled. It's going to go up, but not double. And it's going to be a one-time change. That's not what we really mean when we talk about inflation, which is about money losing value. That's what we mean by inflation. All right. So again, what's not inflation is when prices are going up or down because of market conditions. Sometimes prices go up more in the summer because demand for certain products are higher. And they might go down again in the winter when demand for those products fall. Prices can be very seasonal, go up or down depending on summertime, winter time. Again, not inflation. That's just the market conditions are changing. Now, when you have relative prices changing, the government should not get involved. And generally speaking, it does not get involved. If you get involved with relative prices changing because of changing market conditions, you're just going to make the market less efficient. So you don't get involved in that. You let the prices change according to market conditions. Where governments get involved is when they are trying to control inflation caused by money itself, monetary value of money. That is, if inflation is high because we have maybe too much money in the economy and prices of goods are going up, value of money is going down, then the government will try and control it, usually through the central bank. The central bank is in charge of this. And they try and control it through what we call macroeconomic policy. That is by changing the amount of money in the economy, the interest rates in the economy, and the amount of government spending and taxation as well. That's what we call macroeconomic policy, and we're going to study that later in the term.